This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, an online learning community. Have you ever worried whether you were doing your job right? At the Institute, we turn researchers into fundraising intelligence assets, leading your development officers to the biggest and best donor prospects, and bringing your organization major gift success.
But with prospect management, we can come in even with an older database and do an analysis of a portfolio. We can pull the data out, play with it in Excel, and look at this, do a basic analysis, see where everything is currently at with your prospects, and then figure out how to prioritize that. Because whether you have 50 or whether you have 500, you still have to figure out where to start and where you're trying to go with it.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for research and prospect management professionals. I'm your host, Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm excited to be talking with Ruthie Giles, a prospect management rock star. Hello, Ruthie. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Thank you, Jen. It's great to be here.
So before we get started on our topic of prospect management, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about how did you find your way into fundraising and research and prospect management, and then what are you doing now?
So probably like a lot of people who work in this field, I didn't take a very straight or obvious path into this profession. Back in the day, my undergraduate degree was in geology, which is a far cry from what I'm doing these days. For a while after getting out of college, I worked in the for-profit sector, different types of management organizations. I worked for construction management. I worked for an apartment management company, and I worked for a financial management company. So various areas, all management companies, but various areas within the for-profit sector. And I thought I was going to be in the for-profit sector for a while. So I actually went ahead and got my MBA, did all that work. And then one day when I was needing a change professionally, I was looking through back in the day when you looked in the newspaper, and I saw this ad that just said researcher. And I read the description. I thought to myself, that sounds like something I'd be really good at. I don't know why I thought that. Everything in the description sort of spoke to me. So I went ahead and applied, not knowing at all what the nonprofit world looked like or any of that. And clearly it worked out. Here I am. That organization had not had a researcher before. So I found myself sort of blazing my own trail sort of internally, putting together how prospect research would work there. And then I had to find my own professional network externally, which was really difficult because this was well before the days of LinkedIn or Facebook. Those didn't exist. So I leaned heavily into the local, like what now is the chapter of APRA, the network organization. I leaned heavily into them, but even that was hard to access because everything was in person back in those days. And a lot of the events happened in Boston. I'm in Massachusetts, but I'm on the other side of the state. So it was challenging at the beginning, and I felt very isolated. But over time, things changed. And yeah, I just kept building my skill. I kept being curious about more than just wanting to do research. I kept seeing areas where we could do process improvements. For example, the gift officers had portfolios. They kind of in their head knew where people were in their portfolio, but they didn't really have it well organized. And I thought, well, that's just not going to do. This is not helpful. So to try to help them organize how their portfolios looked and how they were thinking of each prospect within them so that they could approach their work in a more organized fashion and be a little more effective. But I was doing this like from the bottom up because I wasn't at their level according to the organization chart. This position of researcher that I had was sort of down and to the right. No one really knew what to do with it. So it was challenging. But over time, things changed, organizations changed, research became more popular, more known, more needed, more accessible to get to the resources we need. And I continued on the path of looking for process improvements as well as research. But the process improvement side of the house really spoke to me. And that's how I sort of landed it in the world of prospect management. So there was no real path. It was just a little bit of luck and a whole lot of intuition and instinct.
I love it that you were in construction and financial management. It explains so much about you, Ruthie, because I came out of the law side, and as a legal secretary, it's a tough crowd. It's hard to manage in that crowd. And in whatever position you are, you really have to have some thick skin, and you're only going to get by in those positions if you're incredibly organized and you're not going to cry if they yell at you.
Yeah, I found that particularly so when I worked in construction management, being one of the project I was working on at that time was this large grocery warehouse place, but it was all refrigerated warehousing. So it wasn't dry goods, it was all refrigerated goods. And they were working on building it. My office was in this little tiny construction trailer, and I was one of 5 women on the entire project site. At any given day, there could be hundreds of men around. So you really had to have a thicker skin because these were also men who worked in construction. And I was young and I was a woman, and it was an interesting environment to work in. But it was also very enlightening, like how you had to come to work, how you had to, be present and who you had to be in certain groups.
Which serves you well. And you followed that project management path as well. So tell us a little bit about where you're working now. What kind of work do you do?
So I do 2 things. My quote unquote day job is working for the University of New Hampshire. I am the director of prospect research and management, and I oversee a team of 6. And there are 3 who work primarily on the prospect research side of the house. And then the other 3 work in either managing some of the more high technical stuff within the research realm, the pipeline management, the data analytics, the project management side of the house. So managing that team is a lot of fun. And they're a really great team, very smart. So I did not build the team per se. I inherited the team, so I got very fortunate there. So I do that during my day job, and I work remotely. So while I work for the University of New Hampshire, I used to live in the western side of Massachusetts. And then for my other work, nights, weekends, and any free time I can fit it in, I am a partner for prospect development with Stoppel Analytics Group, which is consulting work. And I also really love that. And they're a great team. Like, I can't complain. I got the best of both worlds going on. But that keeps me sort of involved with other organizations that I might not otherwise have the opportunity to work with. So I've worked most of my career in education, with a small stint where I worked at a Jewish foundation, which is really interesting. But most of my career has been in the education realm. So when I'm doing consulting work, we could be doing anything. We could be working with the museum. We could be working with a human services organization. We could be working with organizations that, animal rights activists, that kind of thing. So it's just interesting to see how other organizations that aren't education function in the nonprofit space, and specifically for what I do, within prospect research and management realm.
I couldn't agree more. It's fascinating. And consulting gives you that perspective. You get to interact with all kinds of people. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. And then I get to bring what I learned from there, anecdotally into the day job and say, well, I saw this happen somewhere else, or I see someone's doing things this way. Maybe we could try this approach, or should we adapt something? There's some small nugget of what I've seen in my consulting world I can bring to my day job, which everybody wins in that case, because I do the same. If something's working well in the day job, I bring that to consulting work and say, this is working really well at an organization I know, and maybe they try it. So it's nice that they're very much complement to each other.
That's great. So one of the things I'm curious about, given your broad base of people, organizations you worked with in prospect management, if I go in to work with someone and it's a major gift officer, small team or large, right? Doesn't matter, but they have a portfolio and it's more than 100 people. And I always want to know, okay, when you walk into the office today, how do you know what to do? And this harkens back to your original entryway into prospect management in terms of process improvement. Like, they typically don't have a great answer for how they manage their 100 plus people, or they may be doing it, but they can't seem to articulate it. In your view, as you've seen many different places, how does prospect management help the major gift officer manage that portfolio practically?
Very challenging keeping track of all those relationships, to be sure. At the beginning of the day, right, a gift officer not only needs to keep track of their personal and their professional relationships, but now they have this portfolio of anywhere from like 50 to 200. I've seen one up to 400 prospects that they have to manage. And that's far too much information to retain. So fortunately, most organizations have a database. Some of them even have a really great database. But having at least a good database, that's important. Even with the database, though, there are limitations, right? And that's where the prospect management really can step in to assist with a real strong assist. Because not all databases are created equal, and I'm not picking on databases, just some of the organizations we see out there are using a database that might be older, so it doesn't have all the bells and whistles as the new shiny ones that are coming out. But with prospect management, we can come in even with an older database and do an analysis of a portfolio. We can pull the data out, what I like to refer to as play with it in Excel, which is to avoid bogging them down with the details. I always say, I'm going to play with this in Excel and look at this, do a basic analysis, see where everything is currently at with your prospects, and then figure out how to prioritize that. Because whether you have 50 or whether you have 500, you still have to figure out where to start and where you're trying to go with it. So today you might be working with a certain group of prospects, but 2 months from now, you might be working with an entirely different group because you're continually moving those relationships forward. They're all at different places and you need to be able to keep track of it. And that's where the prospect management comes in. I think about it a lot like air traffic controllers at one of those super busy airports before portfolios. We're trying to make sure that the portfolio is balanced. It has a good balance of people in each different donor cycle stage. So you don't have everyone being asked for money at the same time. Likewise, you don't have everyone trying to be qualified at the same time. And then we also have to make sure we're doing the housekeeping pieces. Like, do some of the prospects need to get disqualified? Do we need to move them to another area? Perhaps they're no longer a prospect for this program, but maybe they're more planned giving, more annual fund. Or do we need to bring someone back in the fold who's been either deprioritized or disqualified earlier? Like, are we looking at them again and saying, you know what, the timing for this person's right, let's bring them back in. So we're constantly looking at all of those things using various analysis methods, a lot of pivot tables and Excel comes into play for most people in this realm. And looking at the data through a slightly different lens than the gift officer and saying, here's where I'm seeing voids and here's where I'm seeing things that are too bunched up. Let's see if we can regulate this a little bit for you so that you have a much more structured way to look at who am I dealing with this week, this month, this quarter, this year. And that way we can try to move everyone through that portfolio. And some of them, will eventually go back into, say, cultivation for a second gift at some point. But we're still trying to move everyone together in a nice, easy way, much like the way the ocean ebbs and flows, right? You want to make sure that things are moving forward and backward constantly.
That's a great way of describing it. I really like that. I think I'm going to steal that. I'll give you credit. That's fabulous. One of the things I'm just dying of curiosity because I get to talk shop with you today. So a lot of times people are focused on a prospect status, the gift cycle status. So identify, cultivating, soliciting, stewarding, and then hopefully moving that around again. But then there's also the gift opportunity or gift proposal, which is often a separate spot in the database. And that then too has its own cycle. Some places use both cycles, some use only one. What are your thoughts on that? What have you seen maybe that's like a really fantastic way to do it?
So with that, sometimes how an organization chooses to track that information is going to really depend on how their database can store it and handle it. Also, if you convert from an old database to a new database that can actually handle more, you still might stick with that old way of doing things because there's other processes, other reports, so many things that are tied to the old way of doing things that changing it would break a lot of your processes and reports and you would need to rebuild them. So before you change them, even once you've converted to your new database, you really need to be thoughtful about what you're going to change and what it's going to impact, like all the sort of downstream implications of every small change. But in essence, prospects have stages that they move through, donor cycle stages, right? So from identification all the way through stewardship and then various places in between. And a proposal has its own because that's a small project, if you think of it that way, within the donor cycle stages. If you think of them as projects, like cultivating is its own type of project, moving along. But the proposal or the opportunity is really its very specific project that could live as its own donor cycle stage or could live sort of, I think of them as two cogs in a wheel that are turning together at the same time. So they live sort of together and symbiotically, but they're still separate, but they're very much related. And I've seen some places do it pretty well. Some places are very loosey-goosey about how they do some things. They just say, oh, well, we asked them for money and we are going to track it somehow. And they don't track all the particulars, and other ones track everything along the way. And there's advantages to both. If you're tracking every little detail, you have a really good record of how much time things take and how long things stay in certain places. But then you need the staffing to be able to track all that information and then use it in a way that's helpful. So you really want to just figure out what works for your organization. If you are a small shop, and I've been a small shop where I was the chief cook and bottle washer of all things prospect development, you pick something that's fairly simple. If you're a bigger shop or you have a nice robust database that really has a lot of places you can put data, you might get a little more granular with it, but you got to pick what's going to work for you and size it accordingly. Because otherwise, if you pick something too big for a very small shop, it never gets done. And vice versa. You pick something too small for a big shop, it's not enough.
I hear you. And like a good consultant, it was sort of just, it depends. It depends on the database. It depends on the size. Depends what you're trying to accomplish with it. I hear you. So before I let you go today, do you have a resource or a top tip to recommend for those prospect managers out there trying to continuously improve their work?
Yes, a large part of prospect management is based in for-profit techniques. So many of us doing this work, we live in our nonprofit world that we forget there's another side of the house, that we know it, but we don't pay much attention to it. But prospect management is really based on for-profit techniques. The two primary ones are lead management and total quality management. Those techniques should be really baked into any prospect management work that you're doing. And for people who don't have specific education or training in those areas, I'm not suggesting that they run out and sign up for an MBA program. There's some great books out there on these management techniques, but I would start with the classics. I would recommend reading some of Peter Drucker's work. He's the father of management, and he's known that way. I didn't make that name up. But Peter Drucker has some great writings out there. It's a good foundational knowledge of how does management work in the first place. And then I would couple that with some of the works of W. Edwards Deming, who's known as the father of total quality management. Those two things coupled together right there will build a super strong foundation upon which you can continue to get education, if it's webinars, if it's in person, if you want to get your MBA, sure, or if it's more readings. But those two things right there, Drucker and Deming, will give you enough of a foundation to build anything you want for your prospect management knowledge base.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, you're welcome.
That was Ruthie Giles, prospect management rock star at the University of New Hampshire and with Stahlpel Analytics. How surprised were you that Ruthie started off as a geology major, and yet the recurring theme of her career has been project management? The curious minds of prospect management and research strike again. She reminds me that project management is indeed a trainable skill set. And if you've ever played with a Gantt chart, you know what I'm talking about. And now I hope you're inspired to run to your library and check out books by Peter Drucker and W. Edwards Deming.
Hey there! Do you manage a prospect research team, or were you newly hired as a prospect researcher? Then you'll be delighted to hear about the Institute's Career Agent Track. In this bundle of 4 courses, participants learn how to build great profiles, calculate capacity ratings, the basics of prospect identification and prospect management, ethics, and the fundamentals of analytics every team member needs to be skilled in. If you need to build the research skills of a fundraising intelligence asset like this, sign up today at member.prospectresearchinstitute.org/career agent.